Hey, want to see your favorite game covered on a future episode of SoberDwarf? Because voting for Subscriber Appreciation Month is currently underway. And this year, the more subscribers I get, the more games I cover. Go ahead and click on this card or the video link in the description below. But don't wait, because voting ends soon. You know, I actually like how they use the door opening that kind of high, and that's a reference to Sweet Home, in case you didn't know. Alright, so we're just going to move forward and... Do you feel it? That rising tension in your stomach? You know it's coming. Your mind is anticipating that moment, where silence is violated by cacophony, and safety defiled by threat. If you remember the early days of the PlayStation, then there has been at least one experience that has stuck with you for over 2 decades. This isn't just a jump scare. It is the jump scare that terrified millions of gamers in 1996. And I think it's about time we take a closer look at it. This is Building Character, an in-depth look at some of the most memorable experiences in gaming. And today, we're talking about Resident Evil's Cerberus Corridor. But are you ready for it? You sure? Okay. Here we go. We've already discussed Resident Evil a handful of times on this channel, but even then I cannot reiterate enough just how different Resident Evil was from other games released in that era. The formula of traditional game design, that was all thrown out the proverbial window. While today we might expect the slow starts and heavy resource management from survival horror, in 1996 that was all but unheard of. Games often put you immediately in the action, gave clear goals, were praised for responsive controls and intuitive game design. The horror genre was more for games like Splatterhouse or Castlevania, but that was more for theme than it was tone. While Resident Evil wasn't the first survival horror game, it was one of the first games to introduce players to the concept. The game starts off with a live-action cutscene involving one of the game's creatures, the Cerberus that, if you squint really hard enough, it would seem like it's kinda scary.
No! Don't go!
Even after you start to explore the mansion, you're introduced to the zombies via this iconic cutscene. And things are relatively quiet and, let's be intellectually honest with ourselves, not at all scary. Resident Evil might be a horror game in theme and even tone, but it doesn't really do much to invoke fear. It's stressful, sure. The lack of save points and ammo and how difficult it is to avoid zombies in these narrow corridors makes it clear how vulnerable you are, but that's more survival, not so much horror. Once you start getting comfortable with the game's mechanics, that fear has already started to wane. By the time you reach this corridor, at least with Chris, you've already become acclimated to the game. The lack of shuffling or a zombie moaning means you are pretty much completely safe. In fact, even more astute players might notice that this desk is interactive just by how it's rendered. And the game has taught you already that these usually conceal... The Cerberus Corridor was the shattered window it heard around the world. But what exactly made it so memorable, and not only that, but fondly remembered? There have been plenty of jump scares in games, almost to the point of complete global oversaturation. Yet this is one of the few that did it right. So what exactly was it that made this scene so good? Can jump scares be scary? Well, I guess I should talk about it, shouldn't I, instead of just stare at the camera. Obviously, we can't discount the novelty of the situation. This was possibly the first time that many gamers had ever experienced a jump scare in a game before. It's sometimes easy to forget that Resident Evil was released over 20 years ago, during a time when we still didn't quite know what 3D gaming was even capable of. I mean, you really want to talk about horror? This game was also released in 1996.
Oh, look! An arrow! Aren't these game designers wonderful?
It's possible it was just burned into the minds of so many because it was something we weren't familiar with. However, jump scares weren't exactly an unknown concept. Horror movies had been using them for far longer than Resident Evil, and it wasn't even the first game to include them. You could argue that Splatterhouse had the basic concept of a jump scare. And Kenji Ino's D had featured them a full year before Resident Evil. Even Clock Tower for the Super Famicom had predominantly featured the psychological horror of surprise before Capcom's foray into survival horror. Technically, it wasn't even the first jump scare in the game. Depending on your choice of path and character, a proverbial skeleton literally pops out of a closet before you reach the corridor. And not only that, jump scares aren't exactly the most fondly remembered. They are often seen as cheap and lazy, and though scare is in a phrase, they don't exactly elicit fear. In fact, they're more accurately described as a startled response, a reaction. Without going into a bunch of facts discussing the amygdala and neural connections, our reactions to sudden noise and threat was developed during a time when it was important to react in tense situations. It's an instinctual response, one that we don't really have control of. So when a horror game has a jump scare, most often accompanied by a loud, piercing noise and something jumping out at you, it comes across as, "I got ya! I totally got ya! You were scared, bro! See, we're too spooky for you!" But it isn't scary. You don't feel afraid. At worst, you feel tricked or manipulated. You might even come to realize you weren't even fearful to begin with. All of a sudden, that delicate illusion that horror requires is completely shattered. That's not to say all jump scares are bad. Despite their reputation, they are one of the more effective tools in horror. Like anything, it depends on how they're used. Jump scares are really just a narrative device, similar to a character death. When they're used correctly, they're one of the more powerful moments in a story, but can just as easily be misused as well. There are a lot of contributing factors such as build-up, pacing, intensity, but ultimately it's about the conversation that moment is having with the audience. Like some sort of jump scare whisperer. And the Cerberus corridor is saying quite a lot. That moment where the dogs randomly burst through the window isn't just an isolated moment of fright, but instead is the accumulation of everything that was building up to that point. Yes, Resident Evil isn't really scary, but that's because it's not trying to be. Again, this was made during a time when neither horror games or 3D games were standard. If Resident Evil 1 had started similar to how Resident Evil 2 had started, it would have been unplayable. As a game, it really needed time to get players used to the setting and the controls. That's why zombies were often placed in angles and areas where they could be easily seen. Or even if you couldn't see them, you definitely heard them. That's why you're given so much time to comfortably determine your plan of action. The fear that it is developing is more of a stress of resources. You don't have enough bullets for every zombie, and you most likely don't have enough healing items to cover every mistake. It gives zombies the mechanical threat they desperately need, but you're never in any real danger. Honestly, the scariest thing you've seen isn't the monsters. It's the horror found in things like The Keeper's Diary, or maybe how bad the voice acting is.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
However, at this point, you might have become too comfortable with the game. Players might have felt confident. They explored part of the mansion and might even have more than one clip of ammo at this point. Resident Evil had clearly laid out the rules for how this game works. This canine informs you that the rules have just been altered. In one single moment, that feeling of safety and comfort was taken away from you. This wasn't a zombie. Zombies are slow, they're plotting. You're able to easily move away from them. This was a feral dog. It's as fast as you. It barely gives you any time to react. Up until now, you've only seen these in a cutscene, and there they were made out to be powerful threats. At this point, you don't even know whether this is a boss fight or not. You don't have time to aim your gun and fight it, and chances are you don't have enough ammo or health to deal with it. So you run ahead, not even realizing where you're going when this canine is informing you that you should probably start praying that they don't alter the rules any further. You manage to make it to the next room somehow, trying to process what had just happened, only to realize that you're now in an unfamiliar part of the mansion, and the only way back to the safety of the main hall is through them. But that's not even the worst of it. The worst part is, now you can't trust anything. You don't know if you can trust the windows or doors. You definitely can't trust that bathtub. You're questioning everything because that moment burned into your mind. Resident Evil just became scary. The entire time, the game was setting an expectation for you. You're always gonna know when a zombie's in the room by all the context clues you've learned. You're always gonna have time to react or retreat. While it never explicitly stated any of this, because good game design doesn't need to, the entire time the player was being taught by the game what to expect. Even the aforementioned jump scare involving the zombie in a closet was subtly foreshadowed by a momentary cutscene. It set all of this up, not only so you could get acclimated to the gameplay, but so it could violate it later.
Now the game had set a different expectation. It now teaches you that anything can change for any reason, that you're never safe. At any point, a creature can just burst through the window, and it's going to do it when you least expect it. And who's to say it's not going to do worse? Like throw you against enemies that can instantly kill you, or traps you can't get out of. You never know who's going to pop out around that obscure corner right in front of you. Now the moments when the player should feel safe are when they become most fearful. And Resident Evil takes full advantage of this, often featuring shots and angles focused on narrow hallways or windows that remind you what happened in that corridor. You expect it. You prepare yourself for it. You watch the windows as you go by, and then nothing happens.
Yet that moment was so shocking that you keep expecting it. And you're still expecting it. Don't believe me? Well, you don't have to look much farther than the Resident Evil remake. It's a faithful reimagining of the original. I mean, I already made a 50-minute long video on that, you don't need me to repeat all this. But what makes it particularly interesting is how it handles the corridor. Players of the original still have that shock ingrained into them. They know it's coming. They are expecting it. They are prepared for it. They take a deep breath and walk forward, and it doesn't happen. I mean, something happened, but it wasn't what you expected. Once again, they had violated your expectations. And that's not to say there's a lack of jump scares in the remake. Oh no, it's almost sadistic how it angles its shots, how it often foreshadows them, how it violates these other expectations, including the boundaries that you once thought were safe. But that one you were expecting, that one that has been stuck in your head anywhere from 6 to 19 years, they didn't give you that. And that is what is at the root of horror. It's the violation of expectation. Once you come to expect the jump scares itself no longer become scary. So instead they give you what you don't expect. Then suddenly, that becomes what terrorizes you. Because you know your guard is being...
Proper punctuation isn't a section of English class that can be skipped, it's important. A jump scare is an exclamation point on a sentence that is tension. If every sentence ends with an exclamation point, then nothing has volume. I think nothing having volume is the goal of a game like Dead Space or FNAF. And I get that. But what gets my tension rising, what keeps me invested, is how Resident Evil handles the buildup of tension and its release. It does this in every single game actually, even the ones panned by fans handle quiet time and jump scares with relative grace compared to similarly budgeted titles.
But the Cerberus corridor wasn't just a punctuation, or even a paragraph. It was the entire Rosetta Stone of how you handle survival horror. It might not have been the first or the scariest, but it did it in such a way that had so much meaning and purpose that it was going to stick with everyone who experienced it. And it's just as much part of us now as it was part of Resident Evil. In other words, you could say it was just a moment about building character. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. That mysterious voice you heard was the voice of Dead Palette, and we've actually talked quite a bit on what constitutes survival horror. If that's something you're interested in, you can check that video out. Or if you're interested, you can see what he's doing to completely change online horror as we know it. A very special thanks to all the patrons who made this video possible. Without their support, this channel wouldn't exist. If you're interested in supporting the show, you can check it out at patreon.com/thesoberdwarf. So until next time, this is SoberDwarf reminding you that gaining experience builds character.